There are too many traps on the waiver wire right now. Don't go down the wrong direction and pick up the wrong guys. Here is everybody you need to be avoiding off the waiver wire this week. If you want to stay sharp for the rest of the fantasy football season, hit that subscribe button. It helps me out a ton. We're reaching a ton of new people as well. Or hit that like button to show your support. But make sure to stick around to the end of the video because I will be going over a list of players that are 100% safe to cut ties with, drop off your roster, and make some room for some stash guys. The number one trap of the week, easily Marquez Valdez-Scantling. You can't ignore his hot start to the Saints so far. He comes out, Olave is injured, Shaheed is injured, Mason Tipton, the other wide receiver in this offense, he gets benched from coach's decision. That's led him to see 16.7 fantasy points last week against the Browns, and then 25.9 fantasy points the week before that in week 10 against the Falcons out of nowhere. The big two breakout games. Now, he's the highest trending player off the waiver wire right now in fantasy football, but he is a trap 100%. This man is averaging 29 yards per reception, which is by far number one over guys like Alec Pierce, over guys like Jameson Williams. Really just guys we know to be deep down threat targets. They're only at 20 yards per reception, so that has to come down. He is clear and away that number one guy. So then you look at his target share, only 14% of the targets with 2 receptions last week and 3 the week before that. That is just nothing short of terrible. Despite having these huge breakaway touchdowns 3 in 2 weeks, the separation rate that he's getting from corners just really isn't anything special, and his first downs per route run number isn't anything special. So he's efficient with the deep balls. All the other success metrics really aren't sticking out. But even if he was on your radar, the Saints are coming into a bye week this week, so he'd likely be getting Olave back into the offense. This wide receiver room is going to be crowded once that happens because the offense isn't great in general, and he has a pretty average rest of season schedule for fantasy wide receivers and points allowed. So it's not like that's terrible, but it's not great either. Let me know if you guys are picking up Marquez Valdez-Scantling. I'm going to be avoiding him off the waiver wire, and I assume you should too. But Nick Westbrook-Akine is another guy we need to be avoiding here. Ever since D-Hop left this team, his snap share has pretty much skyrocketed from the 20s all the way up to the 90s, almost 100%. That's great for him. He's on the field. He's running routes because of it. He's second on the team in routes run behind Calvin Ridley, but he's essentially tied with him because it's not that much of a difference. But we have to be realistic with the target share. Not every wide receiver is a volume guy. We have to be aware of that. Some wide receivers can be viable without a bunch of targets. If you look at guys like what Rashid Shaheed was before, or maybe Xavier Worthy or Jameson Williams, they don't get a ton of targets, but they get a lot of fantasy points when it does happen. It's just a little bit more risky. And these secondary players rely solely on touchdowns. It doesn't mean that they're trustworthy. He just had 12 receptions in 4 weeks. That's 3 receptions a week if we're being more specific here. And if we look at the last few weeks, he finished with 2 receptions and 6 targets and 117 yards against Minnesota last week. The first week, over a 20% team target share. Also his 5th highest target game in his career of 5 seasons. That's the 2nd highest yardage game he's had as well. Not to say that that means a whole ton if you're looking at his entire career stats, but if you look at this season, he's had 5 touchdowns in his last 6 games. That's just not sustainable by any means, especially looking at the target share that he's been seeing. If you take all the touchdowns out of his fantasy finishes, he's averaging less than 5 points a game. It's just something we can't be trusting, even at a flex spot. He does get a positive rest of season schedule and fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, but what can we really expect from him in an offense led by Will Levis? If you go ahead and look at the next player here, a running back that I would not be adding this week, it's going to be Jerome Ford after dropping 7.9 fantasy points after his bye week coming off that in a very positive matchup against the Saints run defense. The main issue here, he's jumping into waiver wire value pretty easily, but this is because his involvement last week, 56% of the snaps compared to Nick Chubb at 30. We look at that and we're saying, okay, what is going on here? 5 carries for Ford, 11 for Nick Chubb, but more importantly, 4 receptions to Chubb's 0. He's running a ton of routes. Chubb literally almost ran none. And you look at the splits, they're actually in Ford's favor as far as what he did with his time on field. 16 out of the 21 2-minute drill snaps and 8 of the 9 third down snaps. Unfortunately, we can't take any of what he did last week and these valuable statistics as anything more than what it was, because the game environment just was not there. The Saints were blowing them out 35-14. It wasn't really close. He's a fine handcuff. Don't take the numbers from last week as he's going to be a startable guy and over Nick Chubb. Maybe he's not healthy yet. Nick Chubb is this RB1, but it's probably going to be split 50-50 for the rest of the year, but neither of them are really going to be startable until we see something different, and they have a decent rest of season schedule as far as fantasy points allowed to running backs goes. More running backs, though, I will cover here, specifically Amir Abdullah. Madison and Zamir White are dealing with injuries. White with the quad and Alexander Madison with an ankle, which leaves Abdullah to be the RB1 facing the Broncos this week, who allow the 5th most receiving yards to running backs on the year and a general good amount of success to running backs so far. So we look at this and we say, all right, Amir Abdullah is going to be that guy. But we have to remember Dylan Lobb still exists in this offense, and he would 100% split some of the snaps with him if both of these starters happen to miss. There's 6 teams on bye this week, so there's going to be a lot of players, a lot of league managers that need some guys out there to fill in the running back position. but they're not going to be one of those guys. Even if we do have both of these starting running backs injured, we can't expect anything, and there is a real high chance that one of the starters ends up playing this week. It's not like this offense is amazing. They're actually really bad. 31st in rushing attempts this year, 32nd in rushing yards, 6th in passing attempts, cool, but 20th in passing yards and 30th in total offensive ranking. So we don't need to be adding these guys even if their starters are injured. Another guy, speaking of injuries though, Ray McCloud. Yeah, he's an absolute trap. He dropped 10.6 fantasy points last week against the Broncos, catching all 6 of his targets for 46 yards. But this game really wasn't close. It was all types of whack. The Falcons lost 6-38 to the Broncos in a game where Ray McCloud played 98% of the snaps. That's normal. Everything else isn't though. But more importantly, we have to look at Darnell Mooney dealing with an injury which could cement Ray McCloud as a wide receiver 2 moving forward for however many weeks that's going to happen, which by the way has proven to be a very valuable role in this offense. We see how good Darnell Mooney is. He's a top 10 wide receiver on the year. But we can't get ahead of ourselves. Darnell Mooney's hamstring injury is not expected to be serious at all. Every single report has come out saying that he's not expected to miss a ton of time with it. Even if he was, the Falcons are coming into their bye week this week as well. So you'd have to be sitting on Ray McCloud another week until you can start him in week 13. There is a good chance that Darnell Mooney is healthy coming into that matchup against the Chargers defense, which is tougher in fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. But the good thing about Ray McCloud, if you're going to pick one, is that the Falcons run a ton of lighter sets, meaning that they have a lot of their wide receivers on the field. So even with London and Mooney healthy, he's still going to be averaging 90% of the snaps for the rest of the season, which is good, but there's so many other options in this offense to get receiving yards. Again, Darnell Mooney, London, Bijan Robinson out of the backfield, Kyle Pitts, even though he didn't do anything last week, he's still there for competition for targets. And speaking of that target competition, Curtis Samuel is another wide receiver pushing up the waiver boards that we just need to be dropping and not adding on our waiver wire for that fact, dropping 16.8 fantasy points last week against the Chiefs, one of the toughest defenses to score on. We just don't need to be dealing with it though. This is amplified because we had Keon Coleman out last week, and Dalton Kincaid was also out with an injury, and more importantly, Amari Cooper was considered healthy coming into this matchup, only plays 51% of the snaps and finishes with 3 total targets. That is insane. So when you look at Curtis Samuel, he was leading this wide receiver room technically, but in reality, there is no way that he is a viable guy moving forward, especially when you have Josh Allen doing what he does in the red zone as well. And we still do have Khalil Shakir healthy in this offense, the slot guy that gets a ton of targets. He really is breaking out for this offense. Even when all of these wide receivers are healthy, he's going to be the wide receiver 4, even 5th option behind Dalton Kincaid, so there's just no room for him to be viable. Yes, he put up a lot of points, but it's not going to be something that can continue. Not to mention another team that's going through a bye week this week, which will give him time for Coleman to come back, and we're just not going to be adding him. So there are a ton of bye weeks this week. I understand why you need to reach a little bit lower to get these guys. He's not a fill-in guy, but he's not a rest of season guy either. But to be quick, a list of players that we can drop, Tyler Lockett is going to be number 1. We see that JSN out-targeted DK for the first time. In this wide receiver 2 system, there is no way that Tyler Lockett can be viable. We talked about him earlier. Lockett, he'll have his moments, but as a 32-year-old wide receiver, there's really nothing that he can do and no upside that makes us want to have him on our team. We know exactly what he can do, and it's not necessarily a ton. Way too many people are still holding on to Ezekiel Elliott for some reason, though. With no Dak in this offense, it severely lowers the upside. Rico Dowdle clearing away this RB1. We can also go through and drop Dawson Knox coming into a bye week here. Kincaid will most likely be healthy after that, and he will be droppable. You don't really need to put him in. He's not going to be playing any of the snaps. Mike Gesicki can also be dropped. I feel like I've been talking about him for so long. When T. Higgins is healthy in this offense, his target share drastically decreases. He's healthy. There's no reason to have him on our team. Drop Demarcus Robinson as well. There's no way this guy should be rostered in 41% of leagues right now, let alone being started in 15%. Cooper Kupp's healthy. Puka's healthy. Everybody's in this offense. There's no room for him to be viable. Jordan Mason can also be dropped if you don't have Christian McCaffrey. If you do, I would suggest you to hold him just because you've held him for this long to get CMC back. If he does get injured, you have no chance at winning. He's nothing more than a handcuff running back you don't really need to be adding because he's not going to get any usage without him. He saw 5% and 3% of the snaps without him in his first 2 weeks back. But that is going to finish off this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. All glory to the man above.